So welcome to this morning's webinar. My name is Charlie Aves. I'm the Executive Officer of the Irrigated Cropping Council, and I'd just like to welcome you all along today. We're trying to make this event as interactive as possible, so we really encourage you to ask questions and join the discussion. This webinar is supported by Golden Broken Catchment Management Authorities from the Ground Up program through funding from the Australian Government's National Land Care program. We do have Karen Brisbane on the line today. Karen, did you want to say a few words?
No, it's all good. Keep going.
Keep going. I'll keep going. I'll start off with a little bit of housekeeping. To help us make this as engaging as possible, we encourage you all to use the chat function. So it'd be great if everyone could now introduce themselves in that chat function and just let us know what you're hoping to get out of today's session. You should see that your microphone has been automatically set to mute. So please leave it that way unless you're talking. To check it or to unmute, the bottom is in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. And should have it be in red in colour with a line through it when you're on mute. If your internet connection is struggling, we do recommend you turn your video off, and that's the button right next to the mute button on the bottom left of the screen. To get sort of the best viewing experience, we suggest that you would select the speaker view up in the top right-hand corner of your screen during presentations. So this will allow you to focus on the presenter rather than seeing a bunch of small faces. We are a nice small group today, so if anyone has some questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and join the discussion. I'm aware it can be a little bit awkward to pick a moment to jump in on these virtual platforms. So again, please feel tripping over my words this morning, please feel free to use the chat at any time. So now the housekeeping is out of the way, I'll introduce our first presenter. Damien Jones, you should all know anyway. He's our trial manager, and he's just going to let you know the research work that we're doing that's linked to this project, Golden Broken CMA project, and some of the other work we're doing on soils locally in the region. So I'll hand over to you, Damien.
Thanks, Charlie. I'll start by giving a little bit of a background of how we've arrived at this point. So we've established a demonstration site at just east of Congupna, thanks to the Golden Broken CMA helping us out. And the intention is to improve our soil carbon. We did a project many years ago with AgVic with Peter Fisher, looking at what is the optimal soil carbon percentage we want. And we looked at a lot of paired paddocks, and he came up with a figure of we need about 2% organic carbon. So how do we get to that? Because a lot of our soils aren't at that 2%. First of all, I'm not a soil scientist, so I'll apologise in advance to any soil scientists out there if I refer to the soil as dirt during my sort of bit of a presentation. So how did I become very interested in soil organic carbon? It was really when we took over the trial block here at Kerrang. The soil's a self-mulching grey clay or a grey vertisol. After years of pasture, we were going to go into cropping, so we decided to disc it. And of course, it was a bit rough, so we disked it again. It was not good enough to irrigate, so we smudged it, and still a bit rough, so we smudged it again. So by the time we did all this work to it, we pre-irrigated it. When we came to sow, yeah, it was just grey slime, grey sludge. We couldn't get it. It was very difficult to sow into. Our knife points simply created a big slot. And then once we did actually get some crops sown, we got a bit of rain on top of it, the soil just absolutely crusted. So what we've done is effectively smashed our soil structure and just turned it into a structureless grey blob. So first of all, why didn't we add gypsum? Because you can do a fairly simple little test, and we worked out that our topsoil isn't dispersive. And I'm not sure if Susan, our next speaker, will expand on that. But what we need to maintain our soil structure in our surface is a bit of a glue, and the soil organic carbon acts like a glue to help that, to reduce that slaking. So, as I said, we've got this nominal target of 2%. If I look at our latest soil tests, they're currently between 1 and 1.2%, which isn't real high. And it was a little bit of a concern when I actually went back and found the oldest soil test we've got was from 2003, where we had somewhere between 1.4 and 1.6% organic carbon in our 0 to 10 centimetres. So this is a loss of about 0.4%, which is about 5 tonnes to the hectare of organic carbon. So I'm a little bit concerned. So how do we increase our soil organic carbon? In my opinion, retaining stubble alone, while it's got some other positive benefits in terms of maintaining, protecting the surface and all that sort of thing, it's not going to help really build our soil organic carbon levels up that much. So one of the researchers who's done a bit of work is Clive Kirkby. He's worked for CSIRO. I think he's with Charles Sturt at the moment. But he did a lot of work, well, it's many years ago now, where he was looking at managing maize stubbles. And he noticed that despite incorporating 10 tonnes of stubble each year, he was really seeing very little change in these soil organic carbons. So he proposed the concept of accelerating the microbial breakdown with the additional fertilisers, simply because most of the stubbles we deal with, cereal stubbles, maize, stover, whatever, have got a lot of carbon in them and not much nitrogen in them. So if a particular nutrient is low, and in most cases it is nitrogen, then the soil bugs simply nibble away at this carbon that we're giving them, and they can't really turn it into that much organic carbon in the soil. So effectively, it's effectively a slow burn, if you like. So Clive proposed, by adding nitrogen, phosphorus and sulfur and incorporating the stubble, so the soil microbes had ready access to this carbon and we've given them the extra nutrients, it would create a more like a composting situation where the breakdown happens rapidly, and we actually end up with soil organic carbon that we can use and help improve our soil structures. Clive also went further and suggested that our soil organic carbon that we want, which is the humus, so it's the glue and it's also resistant to mineralisation, is the residues of the dead microbes. So that when they break down stubbles, their numbers proliferate, and then when the stubble's all gone, then a lot of them die, and then that produces this soil organic carbon that we want, rather than simply it's plant material converted into soil organic carbon. So we've tried Clive's recipe at the ICC trial block, and effectively the recipe is for every tonne of cereal stubble, you need 5.8 kilos of nitrogen, 2.2 kilos of phosphorus, and 0.9 kilos of sulfur. Now, we've tried it. I think, and Susan may be able to help me out here in her presentation, that there's a certain assumption about how much carbon we will turn into soil organic carbon. So in irrigation, where we can supply lots of moisture, we may actually be able to up that rate of how much we can sequester. Because when we've used the recipe straight out as that 5.8 kilos of N, we've seen nitrogen deficiencies develop pretty well shortly after we sow the crop. And conversely, when we doubled it, I created a huge canola crop that lodged and was an absolute tangled mess. So I think there's some refinements to look in what we do in irrigation. So at the ICC trial block, we incorporated in autumn. Works pretty well. We've got warm soils, we've got moisture from pre-irrigation, so that results in lots of microbial activity. One way of assessing the microbial activity is to actually put in calico strips, and these assess the rate of breakdown in the soil. And in our experiment, they broke down within 2 weeks, so there's a lot of activity. If you're going to do it yourself, there's a couple of ways of doing it. I actually use calico. There's a formal process of doing that. Word of warning, paint them another colour because they will rapidly become the same colour as dirt. It's very hard to find, and also the birds like them. So yeah, hide them a little bit. If you want to get more information on that, there's actually a program, it's a worldwide program called Sawyer undies, where growers are encouraged to buy a pair of cotton underpants and bury them in the soil for 2 months. Then dig them up and share what the photos look like. And this is used as an indicator of soil health. So if you want some more info on that, one of the sites that's promoting it at the moment is Cotton Info. Go there and you can be part of the program. So getting to where we are today. So the opportunity was taken to expand our soil organic carbon and general soil structure improvement in irrigated soils with a partnership with the Golden Broken CMA and the federal government's Beyond Soil Care program. It's now part of the From the Ground Up project, integrating agriculture and environmental practices to improve farm productivity and biodiversity. We've also received some assistance from Nick O'Halloran from AgVic, particularly when we have needed to do some science stuff, e.g. when we're looking at sort of infiltration rates under our different scenarios, managing our soil stubbles. So what we have established is a demonstration site east of Kagutna, which is the combinations of stubble that have been applied to the surface or incorporated with or without additional fertiliser according to the Kirby recipe. We also put in some manure treatments and just simply cultivation. The site was set up prior to the summer of 1819 and planted to corn. Now this seemed to be a pretty good match because at the beginning of the summer irrigation season, we've got nice warm soils, we're putting on moisture to obviously get the corn up and away, and we've also usually got pretty good nutrient levels, you know, going to sow a crop of corn, usually lots of nitrogen, lots of phosphorus. So even if we do have a bit of a, you know, the recipe isn't quite right, we've sort of got a backup of just inherently high nutrients in the soil anyway. So to date, the rotation has been maize, followed then by fabers, a summer fallow, and then canola in this season. And just a word of warning, as this is a demonstration site, I'm a little bit wary of drawing too much from the results as there's no replication, and we are seeing some seasonal variation in the soil organic carbon levels that we're measuring. So when we first started, took our normal 0 to 10 soil test, sent it away, got it came back, and we had a soil organic carbon level of 1.67%. Now, in the subsequent 2 years, we've seen a general improvement of our soil organic carbon levels as measured by the general soil test. After the maize, it was 1.73, so a 0.06% increase, which probably isn't that much. And the highest measurement we got was from the surface stubble plus fertiliser treatment. After the fabers and before the canola, the site average is up to 2% organic carbon, with the highest measurement being from the stubble incorporated plus fertiliser plot. Now, that backs up the theory, but as I said, there's a bit of variability because what was the leading treatment with the surface stubble plus fertiliser is now one of the lowest in terms of our measured soil organic carbon. So another aspect we've also been looking at is crop establishment. You know, are we putting all this, you know, we were adding 10 tonne of organic matter into the system. Did that have effect on establishment? No, hasn't had to date, but I think that more reflects the cooperative's equipment being able to handle stubble, as that was his practice to begin with anyway. Whereas at the trial block at Kerrang, we don't have fancy equipment. We've got a good old tine seeder, so adding stubble and not getting it to break down can produce problems for us. Another aspect that we've also looked at, as well as just monitoring our soil organic carbon levels, is water infiltration measurements. And that's, ultimately at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build a better structured soil so we have some, that the moisture goes in better. We don't have surface crusting, etc. when we sow our crops. So, one of the aspects of that Nick O'Halloran has helped us out with is actually measuring the water infiltration. And to date, there hasn't been a great deal of difference. Also, one of the sort of like a side issue that we've discovered at our site is water repellency. Now, I always thought water repellency was something that they had in the West on the sort of those sandier soils. This became apparent when we were growing during the May season. One corner of the trial really suffered from the water simply not being able to get into the soil. It was previously flood irrigated site. It's been converted to overhead. So what was missing now is just the quantity of water that can be applied in one go. So whereas there was probably enough head of flood irrigation overcoming any issues with water repellency, the converting it to overhead has sort of exacerbated the problem. And once it starts, it's very hard to fix because sprinklers putting on, something 15, 20 mil. If the soil's repellent, it simply sheets off, goes somewhere else. So that makes the soil drier, and the next time the sprinkler comes over, it's even worse. And that was just reflected in the corn crop going from, more than 2.5 metres tall down to about 1.5 metres. So that's a real issue that we've picked up. And we've also been doing some work with Nick in terms of testing out some of the products that are available to get around these non-wetting soils. But really, we're struggling actually to see any real result from these products. One little aside, and we're talking about wetters, and some of them are just simply equivalent to the standard herbicide wetter, so BS 1000, except you're putting it on rates of 30 to 60 litres per hectare. It's very difficult to do in crop because if you put 30 litres of wetter on top of faba beans that are about a foot high, you effectively desiccate them. So thank goodness we had a cooperator who was very keen to see what the results were, and he didn't mind us nearly wiping out his parts of his faba bean crop. So to wrap this up, being aware of the limitations of the standard organic carbon soil test is important. As I've mentioned, we're seeing some variation in results. There's some limitations with the organic carbon test simply because there are 3 different types of carbon, and I hope Susan will expand on that a little bit more. And really the basic test doesn't differentiate between carbon, the humus that we want, and bits of plant material. The other limitation, as I mentioned before, is the demonstration style of the project. We've got large plots but no replication. And also looking at some of the other work that's around the countryside, there's been a lot of trials looked at trying to improve soil organic carbon using the Clive Kirkby recipe, just using, just standard incorporation, all those sort of things. But to me, the key finding from many of those is it takes time. It doesn't happen overnight, and don't expect miracles. But one of the, I suppose the other aspect is, and this relates back to the trial block, at least we can stop the gradual slide in organic carbon and fertility that we're seeing as we continuously mine our soils for organic carbon. So even if we halt that, that'd be great. But if we can build it up, that'd be even better.
I've got a couple of questions and comments that have come from Susan. So Susan asked, what soil organic carbon test did you use?
Is it the, Susan will probably correct me, the Walkley Black?
Yep. Yeah, Walkley and Black method. Yep.
Yep. We've just used standard soil organic, sent our 0 to 10 off to CSBP. Whatever they test for is what we've been doing. And that, yeah.
Susan had also noted that water repellency can be caused by the type of plant residues, soil organisms producing waxes to protect themselves from predators. And irrigation water. I'm not even going to try and wrap my tongue around those words. You know how I've all been talking this morning. She's also worked with orchardists and seen some results with sugar and molasses, which basically fire up the microbes to break down those waxes. I had a question. You'd said that your leading treatment, which was the surface stubble plus fertilizer, went from giving the best soil organic carbon result to giving you the worst one over time. Do you have any reason as to why that is, or can Susan help with a reason as to why it went from looking great to just not in the end?
I'll give my 2 cents worth, because I think because we're retaining all our stubbles, we've actually got quite a lot of plant material in the plots. So we do about 40 little 0 to 10 centimetre cores throughout the plots to try and get the best, what do you call it, to make sure that we get a good sample of what's actually there. But I think there's a little bit of luck in the draw on if we push the probe in, if we get that little bit of plant material in this one but miss it in the next one. So I think it's just that variation in the amount of actual plant material that we're collecting when we're doing our sampling is just shifting the results backwards and forwards a little bit. Because I see one of Sue's comments is better use a dry combustion method, which would, I think, help get rid of some of that plant material and stop that from affecting the results.
Now I'm on mute and not able to say anything. If nobody else has any questions, I might introduce Susan. For a lot of you, she probably won't need much introduction. Susan works with the department over in New South Wales at Wagga. Susan's done a huge amount of work focused on, and I'm trying to read this, soil carbon and nutrient cycling in agricultural soils. Her projects have looked at grazing and nutrient management to increase soil carbon, using remote sensing to identify zones to increase soil carbon sequestration, and developing soil organic carbon matrices to value the benefits of improved soil management. Susan, thank you so much for joining us today. And it'd be great to hear what you've got. Thank you.
No worries. Okay, can everyone see the presentation in presentation mode and hear me okay?
Yes, yeah,
fabulous.
we can.
Okay, and thanks for the invitation to come along and chat today, just acknowledging kind of the funding source, being Irrigated Cropping Council and Goulburn Broken, as well as the NLP program. And just wanted to highlight that I guess my involvement with the ICC also stems from a GRDC funded project looking at soil constraints to grain production in the southern part of the northern region, which is a mouthful for GRDC. So today what I want to talk to you about is strategies to build soil organic carbon in cropping systems. And to begin that discussion, I want to take you on a bit of a journey about how soil accumulates carbon and what some of the major drivers are. So just recognizing, looking at the list of participants, there's a range of backgrounds in this space, and Damien's given a great overview of a really practical example about applying some of the science that we know. But I want to take a step back and take you all on a bit of a learning journey. So we talk about flows of carbon around the landscape and how we might build soil organic carbon. And then you'll hopefully identify for your own farming systems or for your own clients practical ways and considerations to build soil carbon and increase the rate of carbon sequestration. So to begin with, let's think about how carbon gets into the soil. So our green plants in our fields take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and through photosynthesis, they fix this into glucose, so energy, and oxygen, and they use that to grow. Now, this really important process builds carbon from the initial stages. So we've got these carbon pumps being our plants, so our solar panels within our paddocks, which take carbon dioxide as a gas, and then they fix it into a liquid form in terms of that glucose and the structure of the plants, and then a solid form once it gets into the leaves and stems and plant roots. Now, if we think about this, this can be partitioned above ground. So we've got leaves and litter, and then we've got manure if we've got grazing animals consuming those. And we've also got below ground contributions as well through roots and root exudates. So root exudates are those carbon-rich signals that plant roots leak out to attract soil organisms to come and live in the rhizosphere. So looking at this process, you've got about 40% of the carbon stays that's sequestered, stays above ground, and about 60% goes below ground. Of that 60% that goes below ground, about half, so 30% in total, gets exuded through the plant roots. And that might only stay in the soil for a matter of minutes to hours to days. But that's a really important currency in the soil to attract organisms to come and live in the rhizosphere, which is that zone of soil immediately adjacent to the plant roots. And what these root exudates can do is it can cause signals between the organisms and the plants to acquire nutrients such as phosphorus and zinc, to regulate and change the soil pH, and to explore the soil for moisture as well. So through fungal associations, for examples, the plant roots can extend the volume of soil that they're acquiring moisture and nutrients from, and the way they trade, I guess, this relationship with organisms is through these root exudates. So it's a really important process that the plant roots will use. So what we see above ground is about 40% of the carbon that's being sequestered. So just to touch on that term, I'll use carbon sequestration quite a bit through the presentation. So basically that's just the removal, capture and storage of carbon into the soil for this presentation. Now, once that plant material is in the soil, it becomes soil organic matter. Now, that soil organic matter can be protected in different forms. So organic matter can be occluded, so wrapped up into soil structure, and then it gets protected by those aggregates. So our larger soil organisms like worms and slaters and beetles will find it challenging to decompose that organic matter because it's within the structure of the soil. It can also be protected in micro aggregates as well. And now aggregate protected organic matter, the reason I like to talk about this is it can be protected for up to decades. So some of our work around Narrabri has shown that organic matter, which I could take a soil sample, take it back to my lab, I dry it, I grind it, I measure it, and I say, all right, well, that organic matter was quite labile, so it was quite tasty to soil organisms, would have been gone in a matter of weeks to years. But what we've shown is that if it's protected within the structure of the soil, it can actually stay in the soil for decades. We can make that even longer if we have that organic matter protected in an aggregate deeper down in the soil profile. So when we're talking about protection and accumulation of organic matter, soil structure is really important. Now, soil organic matter can also be degraded or decomposed by soil organisms as well. And this is really important because this is where most of our nutrients for plant growth come from. So even if you apply fertilizer from a bag, it still needs to go through a microbe to become plant available. So this is a really important process, and they get their energy, their carbon source from our organic matter. Now, as Damien touched on, we can also have stable carbon as well. Now, it might be stable because it becomes, the chemistry of the carbon can become associated with clays. So it means that it's just not as easy for microbes to break down, but it can also become stable through the type of organic matter once it's been through that decomposition process. And the example of that is humus, which Clive has worked on with looking at that nutrient recipe to build humus. So within the soil, sorry, I've got multiple screens going. Within the soil, what we've got is these different pools of carbon. So when we send a soil sample off to a lab, generally they're just looking at the total amount of carbon. But that total pool of carbon is made up of humus, which is those dead bugs and microbial products. So that's how we build it. That gives the soil the dark color. It's made up of charcoal. And when I say charcoal, that's not charcoal that's visible in the soil. That's really fine bits of char. And this is accumulated over tens of thousands of years. And in some Australian soils, this can be up to 35% of that total carbon pool. So it can be really significant in some soils. And then we've got our particulate or our labile carbon. Now, this is the energy source for our microbes. So if we think about our total carbon being like a bank account, for example, it's the cash flow, which is the labile carbon, which is going to be really important, but we make interest on the amount of humus that we've got in the soil and that we build on. But labile carbon, and I'm going to come back to that, is also really important, even though it doesn't stay in the soil for as long as humus. We've also got pathways of loss of carbon from the soil. So microbes, just like us, respire, and plants respire also. And then we also have a loss of carbon via soil erosion. So this is where carbon is physically removed from a site, usually when it's attached to soil particles or because soil organic matter can be very fine and easily moved. Now, if this gets moved to a region where it's, there's a higher soil moisture, for example, then it's probably going to be decomposed and released to the atmosphere. A lot of our soil organic matter can also even leave our terrestrial environment and end up either in New Zealand on glaciers, which kind of hits the news. And that's when you can call it dirt, Damien, when that happens, but generally I wouldn't. Damien and I have spoken about the word dirt. I think he just said it just to work me out. All right, so this process or the flow of carbon around the landscape happens in your cropping environment. It happens in grazing environments. It happens in rangeland systems. So it happens the same flow. All that changes is, I guess, the size of those arrows in that diagram. So if you don't hear anything else from now on, if you have practices which are maximizing biomass production, maintaining adequate plant nutrition, and enhancing soil structure, then you can build soil organic matter. But that's not the end, because I like to talk about soil organic carbon. So you would notice that I've switched between soil organic matter and soil organic carbon. Now, soil organic matter, just to standardize it, what we say is it's less than 2 millimeters in diameter, in length. It's partially decomposed organic residues, it's microbes, it's humus, and it's charcoal. Now, carbon is what we actually measure, and soil organic matter is approximately 58% carbon. Now, two things to highlight on this slide. First of all, you are building up organic matter in the soil that is longer than that 2 millimeter screen that we use to standardize it in the lab. And it's really important because it wraps up soil aggregates, helps with infiltration and maintaining macropores. But just to standardize it, we sieve everything out that's bigger than 2 millimeters. If you're a soil nerd like me, I still sieve it all out but still measure it just to capture it, because sometimes in some systems that's a really sensitive measure of building up soil organic matter. Now, the second point to highlight here is that organic matter, while it's 58% carbon, is a whole lot of other stuff that people spend a lot of money on applying to grow crops, such as nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So our organic matter pool is a really important source of nutrients and trace elements as well. Now, a couple of terms that I'll use when we talk about soil organic carbon percentage, that's talking about the total pool of organic carbon in soil. So in some of your soils, you would also have inorganic carbon, so carbon associated with carbonates. And so we don't measure that in these methods, and that's not necessarily what we're talking about. Now, soil organic carbon percent is exactly the same of grams of carbon per 100 grams of soil, which is sometimes how it's reported as well. We'll also talk about soil organic carbon stocks. So that's the tons of carbon per hectare. Now, because of international protocols, generally we report this to 30 centimetres. The way we calculate our soil organic carbon stocks is we take that soil organic carbon percentage, which I've just mentioned, so the concentration of organic carbon in the soil. We multiply it by the density of soil, the bulk density, and the depth over which that sample has been collected. So for example, if we had 2% soil organic carbon and a bulk density, just to make it easy for maths, of 1, and a depth of 10 centimetres, that's 2 times 1 times 10, so 20 tonnes per hectare to 10 centimetres. And as I said, generally we look at it to 30 centimetres though. And the other term that I just want to touch on is carbon dioxide equivalence, because this is often spoken about now because you can trade soil organic carbon. And 1 tonne of soil carbon is equivalent to 3.66 tonnes of carbon dioxide. So it's a good way to make your numbers look bigger, and sometimes people will use that. So why are we interested in soil organic carbon? Well, there's very clear, undisputable production benefits. It helps with nutrient cycling, it helps with water infiltration and water storage, and it promotes plant growth and quality. And so that's why there's been this decades or hundreds and thousands year long focus on building up the organic part of soil. Specifically, what it can do is it can increase your cation exchange capacity. So that's the soil's ability to hold on to and exchange cations. Now, your cations are calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, and what I always say to people, it's your EMs. So your calcium, your potassium, your magnesium, and that's what your cation exchange capacity is. Now, increasing your soil organic carbon can increase the soil's ability to hold on to these nutrients. And in some soil types, so sandy soil types, most of that cation exchange capacity is attributed to that soil organic carbon pool. So if we were my kids call it the before times. So in the before times, we probably would have had this, this field day all sitting in a machinery shed, for example. So let's imagine we're sitting in that machinery shed and everyone's on chairs and I'm standing out the front. So that machinery shed is our soil. All of those chairs are the exchange plates in the soil which hold on to nutrients. So they determine our cation exchange capacity. And all of you sitting on chairs are your cations. So there's calcium, magnesium, potassium. Now, that amount of chairs that are in that machinery shed are determined by the amount and type of clay and the amount of soil organic carbon. Now, if we build soil organic carbon, what we're doing is bringing a whole lot more chairs into that machinery shed. So you can store, we could have more people there. If we decline soil organic carbon, we remove away half the chairs, for example. Now, half the people in that machinery shed are standing. So what happens when it rains? It gets washed away. Right? So they're not actually attached to the soil. So you've reduced the soil's ability to store onto those, hold onto those nutrients. Now, soil organic matter is also a really important nutrient reservoir. So about a 1% increase in soil organic carbon gives you over a tonne of nitrogen per hectare, about over 200 kilos of phosphorus and over 150 kilos of sulfur. So it's real, and these nutrients are cycling. It also increases our water holding capacity, and we'll touch on this a little bit later on in the presentation, but a 1% increase in soil organic carbon can increase water holding capacity in sandy soils by up to 1/3. And for clay soil or clay loams, up to 10%. So it's really important. The way that it does that is by soil organic matter wrapping up those aggregates and keeping them nice and stable, and by soil organisms decomposing organic matter and producing glues. And this is what Damien spoke about before, which bind soil particles together so that when that soil gets wet and that aggregate swells, it holds its structure. If you don't have those glues in the soil, when that soil aggregate gets wet and swells, it collapses and it slakes. And that's a sure sign of organic matter depletion. So it's really important. But what I want to highlight here is that this is the role of the relationship between soil organisms and soil organic matter. So I refer to this as functional carbon. So while you might not be building up or accumulating organic matter, if you're putting more organic matter in the soil and the organisms are functioning, so turning over those nutrients, as I said, nearly every nutrient needs to pass through a soil organism first before it's plant available, and you're increasing your soil structure, then that's a really important role of carbon in the soil. So then there's also these other services, so ecosystem services that people are talking about, and that's kind of driving a large interest in soil organic carbon. And there's some very real markets out there which are available to diversify farm income. So can you increase soil carbon? You most certainly can. Are you going to make millions out of it? Probably not. But could it be the incentive through some of these trading to change land use or practice? Well, it might be. So it's something to consider, and it's a real option at the moment. The next thing I want to highlight is that soils vary in their capacity to sequester and protect carbon. So going back to the flows of carbon around the landscape, we know that that net increase in soil organic carbon is a function of organic matter supply going in from above ground sources, below ground sources, perhaps from adding an organic amendment to the soil, such as compost, so where you're kind of getting carbon and bringing it to the soil. Compared to how much loss you have through decomposition and erosion. So that's what our soil organic carbon percentage is dependent on. But this can be modified by the type of organic matter. So not all organic matter is as tasty or easy to decompose as others. And it also depends on the soil's capacity to store organic carbon. And that's determined by the amount of clay, the type of clay, the depth of the soil, and the structure of the soil also. We also have these vegetation and climate factors as well. So some of these factors also drive productivity. Some we can change. So we can change the type of plants that we grow. We can have practices which enhance the structure of the soil, but some can't be changed. So we can't easily change the clay concentration or mineralogy or the soil depth. Now, this is a table that for someone who I give lots of presentations and I love it, it's often seen as the thing that you wouldn't do, right, this table, because there's going to be a lot of words and a lot of numbers. But the reason I include it is that so often over the last few years, I've sat in presentations and people said, you can't increase soil carbon. There's no literature, there's no data, there's no evidence. And the thing is, you can, and there is. So there is actually a lot of data around carbon sequestration and soil organic carbon increases. But the couple of things to remember is sometimes the increase is slow and quite unspectacular. It can take a long time to increase soil organic carbon, and it might require a practice change. So this table, before I reveal it, we'll be talking about some of the management factors, and I want you to think about them in terms of that flows of carbon diagram and what might be relevant for your system. The carbon sequestration rate, so that's the increase in carbon in the soil to 30 centimetres per year. And so that'll be in the tonnes of carbon per hectare. The years over which that sequestration or the trial ran, and then the reference, because I'm a soils nerd. Now, the other thing to note, I guess, when we talk about this is that most, even if you've got a trial that goes for 20 or 30 years, most of your sequestration happens when you practice change or land use change in the first 5 to 10 years. So you get this rapid increase and then it plateaus off. And then you need to have another disturbance to keep building. So let's just reveal the horrible table. Okay, so I've broken it up in terms of where most of the data lies. And so if we think about that flows of carbon diagram, it's about organic matter, biomass, and structure. So pastures and pasture rotations play a really important role in that. So there's data around things like liming and pasture rotations, nutrient management and grazing management as well. There's also been a focus on retiring some degraded paddocks from crop into pastures as a way of increasing soil organic carbon. So that's not going to be fit for everyone. And there's also a role for organic amendments. So here's some of the rates that we're looking at. So they range from about 0.1 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year up to 1.5 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year. And I've seen recent I've heard recent stories. I haven't seen the published data, but where this can be even higher with some of the new innovative tools and techniques that people have used. But the reason that this table is important is to know that you can get real measurable increases in soil organic carbon by maximising organic matter supply to the soil, changing the type of organic matter that's going into the soil, and enhancing soil structure. So a lot of my work recently has been around grazing management and the role of legumes. So the reason legumes are so important, because A, there's that productivity benefit of that biologically fixed nitrogen. But remember when I said soil organic matter is 58% carbon? Well, it's a hell of a lot of nitrogen too. So it helps build organic matter through that as well. So DPI has done a lot of work. My colleague Mark Conyers did a lot of work looking at the type of rotation and the length of rotation. What you perhaps may have noticed on this is that there's not as much focus in this table on stubble management and stubble burning. So like Damien said before, keeping stubble is really important for protecting the surface soil. So regulating, I guess, fluctuations in soil moisture, enhancing structure and increasing infiltration, but that alone will not always increase soil carbon. It's about what you do with that stubble. So Clive's work looked at that recipe going, well, if we add nutrients to it, can we drive that microbial process to build humus? But what you're doing is you're actually driving a biological process. So if you've got limitations in your soil to that biological process, like poor aeration or infiltration, then that's also going to slow that process. The other thing is it takes a while to build up humus and to a detectable level. And I can talk about that more in a while, but the way that Clive measured soil organic carbon increases was a way that often most labs won't offer. So it's really hard to find that detectable change in the short term. So there's a range of strategies to increase soil organic carbon. If you look at the default values under the Australian government for their modelling, it kind of ranges from, I think up to, no, I think most for your area, I think I looked it up and it was about 200 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year. So that's the default value, which they'd say if you could increase biomass supply, reduce decomposition, or enhance that balance between supply and decomposition, then that's what you'd be likely to see across 30 centimetres. But then in some systems, you just don't see an increase in soil organic carbon despite best management. And this can be really disheartening. And as I said, this could be a factor of time. So it takes time to build organic carbon. It's really important to remember that soil type and climate are these major drivers, not only of net primary productivity, so the amount of photosynthesis which can happen somewhere, but also the rate of decomposition. So in irrigated systems, when you're talking about warm, moist soils for growing crops and having nutrients that are available, that is prime decomposition conditions as well. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because remember how I went back to that cash flow example about your organic matter? So that labile carbon, which gets burnt up really quickly in that environment, produces a whole lot of glues, which will bind soil particles together. But it does mean that you might not see a short-term increase in soil organic carbon. Sometimes some trials which I've looked at, it might be inadequate plant nutrition, it might have been water limited. Sometimes you can have really high background levels of soil organic carbon, so you just can't detect those changes. And the example I like to use with this is if I had two buckets that are exactly the same size, right? One I fill up with sand and the other one's empty. And then I bring across a cup of sand, okay? So it's a cup of sand. It is what it is. You could weigh how much sand is in that cup. If I poured that cup of sand into the bucket that is already full, I've still added the same amount of sand, but you probably couldn't tell, could you? Because the bucket's already full of sand. But that same amount of sand into the empty bucket, you'd see it and go, well, there's an increase. It's definitely increased. The amount of sand didn't change, but the amount of sand that was already in the bucket influenced our ability to detect that. And that's what can happen sometimes when we're trying to use a measure such as soil organic carbon to detect changes in as a result of land management. You also have spatial and temporal variability. So spatial variability within a site, temporal variability, soil organic carbon bounces around over time, just like plant growth does, and that mirrors soil organism activity as well. And in some cases, hurts me to say, not as much as it hurts me to hear Damien use the word dirt, maybe soil organic carbon isn't the best or the only metric you should be using to compare the benefits of land management. So things like, obviously I've said building soil organic carbon is important for soil structure. And the way in systems where you know you've had a decline in soil structure, it's about looking at how you can influence plant growth through the rotation, through plant nutrition, and through stubble management to influence things like root growth so that you can get that formation of macropores. the provision of organic matter so that the organisms can use that organic matter to glue aggregates together, and the organic matter itself can wrap up those aggregates as well, and that can build soil structure. So is 2% soil organic carbon, the top 10 centimeters, like the magic number? And I think no matter where, the reason I worry about the 2% is that people use it across a range of systems. And the reason that happens is because there's a whole lot of soil properties that are influenced by soil organic carbon. And once you get to that 2%, sometimes, depending on soil type, the benefit of increasing soil organic carbon for these structural properties isn't necessarily as defined. But if we have a look here, and you don't need to know necessarily the numbers, I just want you to look at the trends. So the top left-hand side is in a clay loam soil, and it's looking at the amount of plant available soil across a range of sites. And on the x-axis is our soil organic carbon percentage. Remember, grams per 100 grams is the same as percentage. So increasing from left to right. And plant available water on the y-axis. So this is top left-hand side for a clay loam soil. You can see as you increase soil organic carbon, you increase the amount of plant available water. If we move now to the graph on the top right-hand side, clay loam soil again. Again, we've got our soil organic carbon percentage on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, now we've got the bulk density. Remember, the bulk density is the weight of soil for a given volume. So you can have 0 to 10 centimeters, and if it's really compacted, you've got a higher bulk density than you do if you've got good soil structure for the same depth. It would have a less bulk density because there's less mass of soil there. So again, as you see, as you increase soil organic carbon, you get a decrease in bulk density as well. So you enhance the soil structure. There's no magic trigger that's happening around that 2%. There's the trend, okay? So as you increase it, you increase plant available water, or you decrease bulk density. And both bulk density and plant available water are related. A similar case in the bottom left-hand graph with the sandy loam soil, top 10 centimeters. As you increase soil organic carbon on the x-axis, soil strength, which is on the y-axis. So think about soil strength, about how much energy that plant needs to use to actually push the roots through the soil. That's why it's important. It also influences water infiltration. But an increase, and this is perhaps where you do start to see see soil strength actually be influenced by that 2%. And again, with our kind of bulk density on the bottom right-hand side for sandy loam soils. So I'm not sure that 2% is a good target because it's higher than a lot of the systems in your region have already, but it's really just about making sure that whatever you're doing is you're going in the right direction. So increasing carbon so you can have these beneficial soil property outcomes. So this is my last slide. There's multiple strategies to build soil organic carbon. So it's around plant management. So you could change the crop and pasture sequence. So including legumes, for example, in rotations. And Damien mentioned before about the role of vetch or for building up biological nitrogen. And there's an agronomic value in that alone. But pastures also have a great ability to build up soil structure and that labile form of organic carbon. Cover crops can also be an option in some systems in southern New South Wales. And then the reason the question mark's there is it becomes that balance with water management. So you just have to be a little bit careful about soil. So in non-irrigated systems, that would be perhaps more important. Managing the nutrient input. So remember, plants need nutrients, but also your below ground microscopic livestock, they also need nutrients as well if you want to build up that stable form of organic carbon. So when nutrient drawdown happens, what happens is that the organisms are like, great, I've got this huge amount of stubble in the soil, I've got a little bit of nitrogen here, I'm going to take as much nitrogen as I can from the soil so I can break down this soil organic matter. That means that that nitrogen is immobilized in a soil organism. So when a plant grows and tries to access that, it's not available. So it's in the soil, it's just in an organism, not in a plant available form. The way it goes from that immobilized form in the soil organism into the plant available form is when the next order up predator, like protozoa or nematodes, come and graze on that organism, and then it becomes mineralized into something like nitrate, which a plant can take up. So again, just highlighting that biological process is really important. Overcoming soil constraints. So if you've got acidic soils, liming, so making sure that you can have big healthy plants growing and pumping as much carbon into the soil as possible. Minimizing tillage. So no-till is something that a lot of people have definitely moved to, but there's data now to show that strategic cultivation can actually increase soil organic carbon as well. Retaining stubble. So as I said, sometimes it's about this balance. Some of these practices, and the reason I've said multiple strategies, is some reduce the loss and some build carbon, and it's about having that right mix. Identifying degraded soils and changing practice. So perhaps that's where that role of a land use to pasture may be an option for some people in some parts of the landscape. And then adding carbon-rich materials, so composts and manures, for example, as soil amendments. So in summary, carbon cycling on your farm, no matter what you're doing. So it's already cycling. It's about how you influence that cycle. To change the amount of carbon cycling and to sequester more carbon, you may need to change practice. And that's not changing practice across the whole property, but in some of those responsive zones if you want to build soil organic carbon. So then it becomes thinking about what's your biggest lever? What's the biggest constraint to plant growth or carbon sequestration? For some people that might be soil acidity, it might be nutrients, or it might be just looking at those crop rotations. But sometimes there's just going to be soil and climate factors which are going to limit your potential. So it's not fair to compare dry land to irrigated, or soils which are the same soil type in your region to ones in a higher rainfall zone. So the same soil type can behave differently for carbon sequestration depending on the climate. But undisputably, the benefits of building soil organic matter for fertility, so that biological function of soils and structure, are totally undisputed. There's no arguments about that. But it's not always about getting a detectable increase in soil organic carbon, because sometimes in those first 5 years, it might be about enhancing the function of soil, and then you'll start to build and accumulate carbon. And we've certainly seen that across a lot of our trials. And finally, to increase soil organic carbon, it's about, looking at the right practice, putting it in at the right time, in the right place. So that's it from me.
Great. Thank you for that. We've had a question from Karen. She's asked, who's able to do a dry combustion method test for soil organic carbon?
So all labs these days will offer that. It might be put down as, might be called Dumas, like I can type it in, or it might be called LECO. Just typed into the box. So most labs will offer that. Even I think IPL is not even, and they're offering it now as well. So, and what it does is it just captures that total organic carbon pool, whereas some of the tests that we used to use traditionally have been shown to miss up to 20% of that organic carbon.
Great. You did say that soil organic carbon wasn't always the best thing to measure. What other tests would you recommend people take a look at when they're trying to make decisions on areas to target?
So there's almost there's like nothing new in that space. So it's just looking at areas where you think as a producer you can increase productivity and targeting that. And it can be really traditional tests like soil pH and looking at soil structure if you want to just, or the calico test if you're looking at biological function. So certainly on the market now, there's more sophisticated measures of biological activity, but I'm not sure that the benefit in measuring those is necessarily apparent or more apparent than some of those traditional measures. So soil organic carbon is always going to be a really important metric, and it's a very reliable metric, but it's influenced by a lot of factors. So it's about the value in that number is looking at that number over time and looking at that number in context for what's happening in the paddock, what's grown in the paddock, the season, for example.
Great. Lee's also asked a question. What is the evidence so far of soil organic carbon declining sharply during intense drought events?
Yeah. So what happens, there is a lot of evidence about that. So if we go back to where I had the pie chart, and you've got your humic pool, your char, and your labile carbon. So what happens during intense drought periods, and you get a reduction of organic matter going into the soil, and microbes use up as much as they kind of can while there's moisture, and then they kind of slow off as well in their decomposition, and you use up that particulate organic carbon pool, so that kind of declines. Now, if your soil had low particulate organic carbon anyway, so if that pie chart was mainly for your soil type made up, and your land management was mainly made up of humus and char, we probably wouldn't see a decline in your soil organic carbon. But if your soil had a large amount of organic carbon, because you'd come out of a pasture rotation, for example, so labile carbon is high, particular organic carbon's high, then in that drought period, you'd see a rapid decrease in your total organic carbon measurement. So it just depends what your pie chart's made up of, but certainly there's a lot of data. It doesn't decrease the soil, the humus or the char, but it decreases that really labile form of organic matter.
I was interested in how you target areas. You said you want to look for areas that are responsive rather than just areas that are low carbon. How do you pick those areas out? I know you've done some work in remote sensing and things like that.
Yeah. So looking at the easiest way to do it is where you think you could get a productivity gain. So if there's something where you know that you could either apply or change to enhance organic matter supply or plant productivity. So that might mean changing the plant that you're trying to grow in some areas, and that's where kind of putting something under pasture or pasture rotation might be one of those options. But that's where we've targeted. So a lot of our digital mapping recently has looked at a lot of those factors which you'd use for normal productivity indices anyway. So NDVI and greenness indices, and looking at how they vary over time. But it's not always the clapped out part of your property as well, because sometimes putting resources into an area which is producing well but can kind of go that extra step will be a really wise choice for increasing soil organic carbon.
Great, thanks, Susan. I'm hoping someone else was going to ask some questions because I'm struggling now. It's been really, really insightful. So if anyone does have any questions, put them in the chat. Thank you so much for your insights today, Susan. That's been fantastic. I know soil science is something I did way back when, and I spend my life focused on the plants rather than the soil. So it's been really interesting. Thank you. I have, as people are aware, this workshop has been funded by the National Land Care Program, so federal government money. So before you all run away, oh no, I've got a question, another question from Lee here. Do you hold much faith that Australian soils can accumulate enough carbon to satisfy federal government ambitions?
I think there's a great opportunity to increase soil organic carbon across most of our farming soils. I think what the challenge has been to date is collecting the evidence to do that, because as I said, sometimes our measures aren't sensitive and it does take time. And the way that the methods to date have been set up have been quite time consuming and detail orientated and expensive, and I get that that's what's needed for a trading system, but it's not necessarily needed to demonstrate or achieve those benefits. So I think they can, and I think it's really important, and there's certainly a change now into making looking into methods which are cheaper to demonstrate those increases. And so using what we're using in some of my research, which is where we've come up with remotely sensed predicted increases in soil organic carbon. So there's not that need to go out and take those samples and the expense associated with that. So yeah, I think that, yeah, it's worth doing, and you're probably not going to make millions out of it, but in some cases it might be the incentive that some producers need to make that change.
Andrew Sneed has asked, what are the ratios for NP and S? And I assume that is to build carbon. Andrew, if I'm wrong, just chip in.
So Clive's ratios were for every ton of soil, it was 90 kilos of, and I can type it in, so it was 90 kilos of nitrogen, and then it was, I think it was 19 kilos of phosphorus and 14 of sulfur. I'll have to double check that. That's for every, I've just typed it in there. So that's the ratios in humus. So, and that's what Clive his work looked at, saying, right, well, if you want to, if you've got wheat, for example, wheat stubble, so you might have, I think the ratios for wheat stubble are 17 kilos of nitrogen, 2 of phosphorus, 3 of sulfur, for example. Well, the organisms to make humus are going to need to get the difference in those nutrient ratios from somewhere. So he came up with this recipe around, well, provision of those nutrients through fertilizers or mineral sources, or however you want to get them into the soil. The thing to remember with Clive's work, though, is he was just looking at building humus. So when he looked at the sensitive measures, he removed all the fine fraction organic matter. What that means is not only did he sieve to 2 millimeters, but he sieved to 400 microns, and which is 400 thousandths of a millimeter. So very, very fine organic matter, and that's what he was measuring as humus. And to do that in a lab, like, no one offers that, so only scientists can kind of do that. So that's why you don't always see those increases, but the nutrients are targeted at making that labile carbon into dead bugs and microbial products. And so, but that is the nutrient ratios that Clive came up with for humus. And that stands across international soils, any place. That's just because it's dead bugs, so it's made up of bacteria and fungi.
Yeah, Damo's just stuck the figures in their chat there for a ton of stubble, which is 5.8 kilos N, 2.2 kilos P, and 0.9 kilos S.
Yep.
Andrew's follow-up question, are there any other nutrients needed for that process?
There is, but so the next big one will be potassium, but I still haven't seen kind of what work's been kind of done around that. So Clive only looked at those ones, but certainly potassium would be your next most important nutrient. But I think in Clive's work, he couldn't show any really clear relationships across international data sets, so that he kind of left potassium for another person to, to chase up.
Karen had asked about the link to the Soil Your Undies project that Damien had mentioned, and he also shared that in the chat for those people who are interested in that one. I will keep an eye out for any questions. In the meantime, as I said, this is federally funded, and as a result, we do need to get some feedback from you guys. So I've got my fingers crossed this is going to work. I should have put a poll up there. You should see a poll come up on your screens. If you could give me some feedback on that, and if anybody has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or type them in the chat box. Thank you. Susan's also just shared a link there. Susan, did you just want to let people know what that one's to?
So that's a prime fact that we just released, so a fact sheet, 4-page, I think it is, a couple of months ago, which kind of goes through the types of tests that you can use for soil organic matter, and talking about organic matter build up and decline in cropping systems and strategies to build soil organic carbon. Also touches on that kind of recipe as well that we just spoke about.
Great. Deb has said, of all the things I've tried, manure seems to be the most obvious response for growth. So what manures are you using there, Deb? And how are you applying those to the soil?
I got cow manure from a feedlot and just dumped it in various places and spread it. But I also have alpacas, and they pile manure as well, because I'm on decomposed granite soil, which has really been quite poor. And so I'm just trying anything and everything. I've tried rolling out hay. I've tried dumping the manure. I've tried worm compost, just to see how it reacts. And the best result I have for growth is just cow manure, spreading it and at the highest points of my hills, so that as it rains, it washes downhill. I'm interested in what other people are doing, because I'm trying to find the best, most cost-effective way. Unfortunately, the manure is the most expensive because I don't have cows.
In the trial that we looked at, we've done something with manures, haven't we, Damien?
I'll just unmute myself. Yes. No. Yeah. I suppose from the results that we saw, where we used 10 tonne of manure, and it was pretty well degraded stuff. It wasn't just fresh, straight from feedlot. It had been around a while. We really didn't see it make much difference, so we spread it at 10 tonnes, the same as we did the stubble. So, I mean, that's not to say that that was that it's not discrediting manures at all. In some ways, yes, it's. I suppose my take on it is we can either grow the stuff, and if we can't grow the stuff or not enough stuff, then we just bring it in by truck, and that's a way of doing it. In some ways, sometimes too, the manures are actually a little bit more. They could have higher nutrient levels, which means they can compost or turn into that or feed the microbes better than some dry old stubble. Also, some of the manures I've seen are also pretty low in material, particularly if they've been stockpiled for a while. So yeah, it works. One of the projects we're doing, not related to this one, is an amelioration project where we're using lucerne pellets as a soil amelioration, and it is amazing the result that it's done. Simply with the breakdown of those lucerne pellets with irrigation, the amount of nitrogen released has been huge, and we've seen a huge increase in plant growth. But what I'm concerned about is that we've simply seen too much breakdown, because for that nitrogen to be released, microbes have got to act on the lucerne, break it down into into the nutrients, which means it's, as organic matter, it's been destroyed, and we're losing that amelioration benefit simply because it's broken down so quickly that we're not going to see the residual effects of the ripping plus putting the stuff down the slot. I hope that makes sense.
I think so. If there's no more questions, I'd really like to thank Susan and Damien again for their time today, and also thank the Golden Broken CMA for their funding support of today's event. If you do have any questions, Susan, are you able to put your email address just in the chat there? And if anyone does have any specific questions that they want to take offline, then they're perfectly able to do that, and just have a chat. Damien, if you could stick yours in there too. I think most people will have yours, but there may be the odd one that doesn't. So if anybody does have any questions, they can reach out to you. That would be fantastic. Again, thank you all for your time today. I know time is precious. From the feedback, it does appear it was valuable time and time well spent. So thank you for your feedback today. If you do have anything specific you would like us to tackle in the future, again, put it in the chat or unmute yourself and let us know. Thank you all so much.